I'm afraid there's no music, but I have got a view. My goodness, have I got a view for you. Have a look over my shoulder. That is Signal Hill. I'm in Cape Town and staying at an incredible. Okay, you want to see more? I suppose, Stu, I should try and maybe move out the way so that you got a much better view. Eh?
No, Alec, I'm not sure. I hope the weather matches the view that side, because sometimes the wind blows, but I suppose you wouldn't notice it sitting indoors.
It's unbelievable day. It's in our power hour a little earlier talking to Justin. He said, "Thank you for bringing this wonderful weather down to Cape Town." And I think he's just pulling my leg because the Cape weather, every time I come here, it just wants me, kind of pulling me in. Come to Cape Town. Come stay in Cape Town. Join the rest of South Africa that have migrated from Gauteng. Well, I won't be doing that, but oh man, it's a beautiful day today. And when she's in her finery, the Cape is certainly the most beautiful place in the world. Nice to see that you're in my office and you've got the Drakensberg Mountains behind you, Stu. It's been a busy day down here with the medium-term budget statement. What is it? I better get it right. Eh? Medium-term budget policy statement. I thought presentation statement or something like that, or presentation speech. So anyway, but it's been very interesting. I've thoroughly enjoyed getting to understand a little bit more about Enoch Godongwana, the new Minister of Finance. I'm quite impressed, but I'll tell you why in a little while. Maybe you want to take us through the tech before we go into our webinar today.
I've just had a quick question, Alec. What hotel are you staying at?
It's the Latitude, and you will remember as BizNews community members that with the 12J partnerships that we have a partnership with a company called 12 Cape, and 12 Cape owns the Latitude. So many BizNews community members invested through 12J, through that special, unfortunately now ended opportunity where you could write off your full investment against your taxable income in year one. And I'm convinced that the people who invested with 12 Cape have done a great deal. It's a terrific hotel. I'm so happy to be staying here in Apart Hotels. I suppose I should have come here before as part of our due diligence, but I had to just rely on pictures. But the pictures don't really do justice to the positioning. It's in Sea Point. It's in Kings Road, right next door to the French school, which is, you get the kids shouting and playing in the afternoon, which I thought was just so charming, and very quiet in the evening. Lovely views here. And as you can see, I just got to show you that again, Stu. Aren't you a bit jealous? Just a little jealous.
I can't be too jealous, Alec. I should hopefully have it in my backyard in a month or two, eh? Or a month, sorry,
true.
Not two.
Okay. Yeah, here we have one of the most beautiful places in the world, Cape Town, and it's part of our country. Wow, aren't we privileged to be South Africans? Anyway, okay, so I'm staying at the Latitude, and I can fully endorse it. I'll be staying here. It'll be our home from home in future. That's full on, 100%. And for those 12J investors who went with 12 Cape, you're in the right place, because what I've seen here is they're onto a winner.
Thanks, Alec. I know you mentioned tech. Let's just run through the tech. I know those new to the webinars, there's a little control panel on the right-hand side. There's a little high five button. If you can see Alec and myself and hear our voices loud and clear, can you please give us some high fives? Just there we go. I've got a few high fives coming through. And we do like to keep the webinars conversational. There's a little questions box in that same control panel. If you please put your questions in there, I can pass them on to Alec as he runs through his pearls of wisdom, Alec, because I'm sure what's it, 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock lock in?
No, it's 7. They're getting slack now at Treasury. It used to be 6 o'clock. I can remember going to Pretoria in the middle of the night to get there in time, and then they give you documents like this. Just to show you that I really was there, Stu. I know you guys sometimes think I just, like that famous story about the journalist who goes into the pub and spends his time in the pub talking with his pals, watching the game on TV, and then writing up the story for the newspaper afterwards from the pub. I'm sure it happened many times. There's something that'll just show you I really was there. There it is. Media lockup, it's called. But it only starts at 7. And what was a bit challenging today, in a way, but maybe not so, was that the speech was only given to us just before 1 o'clock. So it was quite difficult to scan through the speech, but going through it was good in one way, because usually what happens is I go into the lockup. Been doing this for some years now. Every twice a year you go for the budget itself, and then for the mini budget or medium-term budget policy statement. So it's a halfway stage. And what usually happens, you go, you get the speech, you read through the speech, you make your notes, you then send everything to the team, you guys in Johannesburg, and it's on the site at 2 o'clock as the minister starts speaking. This year, I guess it is Enoch Godongwana's first budget speech. So his staff and the Treasury staff, the comms wasn't that great, and so his speech, although it had been done the day before, somehow only got to us at 1 o'clock, and that is a bit challenging. However, it gave me the opportunity to work through this document, and there's just it's a mine of great information, and working from that started to pick up some jewels, and then he has a press conference at about, I think it's 11 o'clock to 12 or 12:30, and we'll take you through some of the feedback there, and that's always very good because you get to ask a few questions. I got to ask a few questions today. I mean, there's a full auditorium of journalists. Many of them are there, maybe not really as financial journalists. They're coming to look for the political angles, and there was quite a bit of that. You can see it from the guys, Stu, when they have shaped their questions according to their personal biases, and what about the workers kind of approach came through quite strongly today. But from a financial journalism perspective, and certainly from an investment perspective, there was plenty to like in the way that this trade unionist and a guy who survived a massive scandal has come through. He's one of Ramaphosa's allies from the trade union days, and he's a gent with a very good feeling for exactly what's going on. And to me, it could be a watershed, but we'll get into that in a moment.
I was going to say, Alec, you've been to many of these budgets. How does Enoch Godongwana stack up against the previous finance ministers you've seen in action from a lock-in point of view?
Well, the best by far was Trevor Manuel, and because he not only had a feel, and he grew into the job, and he was in the job for many years, but he had political capital. He came from the UDF, and he had a lot of, but we are going back into the 90s. He was one of Mandela's favorites as well, so he had Mandela's support, and also the technocrat Thabo Mbeki gave him full support as well. And that political capital as a finance minister is critical. You cannot overemphasize it, because you have to try and get through to your budget, to your colleagues in the cabinet, the fact that they can't just keep spending, and you need to prioritize the spending as a nation. It's very easy to spend money, as we all know, but you've got to pay for it. And Zuma didn't understand that. So what Zuma did during his period, and I'll show you some pretty dirty pictures a little later. Well, from an economist's perspective, they're dirty pictures. I suppose the rest of society would kind of laugh at that term, but it really is. From that side, all they did was spend. The last 13 years, they've been trying to fix Eskom, and they've just been spending up by 8.8% per annum. Now, you know the power of compounding. If you grow something 8.8% and your revenues are growing at a fraction of that or much lower than that, what happens is your debt just balloons. And one day you have to repay that debt. And we've got to the stage now where our debt is, according to the finance minister, taking up 21 cents in the budget. So for every R1 we pay in tax, 21 cents goes to service debt. And when Trevor Manuel left, it was probably about 4 cents. It just gives you an indication of how badly this country has been managed in the last 13 years. But maybe we can get into that in a moment. How do I rate him? I think he's got the political capital, which is good. I think that he understands. He's certainly a highly intelligent and a well qualified man. He's got his master's from the University of London in, I think it's financial economics. So he's no mug, that's for pretty sure. And he doesn't have Tito Mbowene's gravitas, because Tito was the governor of the Reserve Bank, which brings a certain perspective with it. But he does have the background of being head of the ANC's economic development operation. So he's got that within the party, and you will see him growing, I'm pretty sure, into this job really well over the years. He's no Malusi Gigaba, that's for sure. That guy was way out of his depth. He used to just carry on, prattle on, and not really make much sense, I guess, as I might be doing right now. Sorry, Stu.
It's all good. I was going to say, you'll probably talk about, I know in the previous few years you've been speaking about this crocodile mouth that was just widening. I don't know if I'm sure we'll go through some data to see if that's still the case or not.
Yeah, that's the big story. I actually asked him about the hippo, as Tito described it, as the mouth of a hippo with a top jaw, or the top part of the mouth being the spending, and the bottom being the bottom jaw being the revenue. So now when your spending goes up and your revenue goes down, as we know in business, in any business, that is the road to bankruptcy. Of course, a country can't really go bankrupt. I suppose it can when it just decides not to pay its debt anymore, but the country's going to continue to be a country. Whereas a company, you go into liquidation, you cease to exist. And that there's promises that that's going to be closing. And I guess that's the big question. Okay, shall I put myself off screen now? Oh, just give you one last picture of Signal Hill in the background here from the latitude, and you just interrupt me, Stu, when you need me, and
Perfect.
we'll go through the presentation.
Thanks, Alex.
I love that quote by the new finance minister. It's day 106 for him, by the way, and it really encapsulates everything. For 13 years, we tried to fix Eskom. Now we're fixing electricity supply. And what he means by that was that the centralized approach by government, by the South African government, has now finally ended. The command and control approach was, we want to be the monopoly provider of electricity to South Africa. And now they've realized 13 years later, and 230 billion rands of taxpayers' money, billion rand. It's just scary numbers, those. That Eskom can't be fixed. That actually what needs to be fixed is the supply of electricity, and what that means is you've got to bring the private sector in to make it happen. So that, to me, kind of encapsulated everything from this mini budget, and I'm not going to call it the mini budget. I'm not going to go MTBPS just for clarification. And thanks to BrightRock, of course, our sponsors who make all of this possible. Right, so let's get into my little presentation for you. I took that picture going out with my iPad, and there he is, Enoch Godongwana, with a pretty nifty hat, which shows he's got quite a colourful side to him, quite a mischievous side, if you like. And I love this picture because the minute he went out there, he was mobbed by people looking for maybe their particular individual quote or maybe their nice picture. And there is the first of the dirty pictures, I'm afraid, and that is South Africa's budget deficit as a percentage of GDP. Why I put this up here, or always focus on this, is because this is what the international community looks at. A good figure is 3%. Anything less than 3% for your budget deficit, what it says is how much is the country spending as a percentage of its economy which is more than the revenue that it's getting in. And as you can see, in 2007, 2008, Trevor Manuel actually delivered surpluses. In other words, for those 2 years, South Africa got in more money than it spent. That's a fantastic place to be, because you are then able to, well, like a household or a company, you're able then to allocate your spending or prioritize your spending from a very healthy situation. What looks, this, as you can see, up to that point, the record deficit, and this graph goes all the way back to 1970, was in 1993, just before the ANC or before democracy arrived in South Africa. There was a lot of spending in trying to get the country ready for democracy. And as you can see there was a record for that year of 7.1%. Well, last year, before the economy was expanded overnight by a rebasing by Stats SA of the GDP figures, we actually came to 14%. So it was worse because of COVID. We had the worst budget deficit by very, very far, by double as bad as the previous one because of COVID. But now they've rebased the GDP figures, and last year has been rebased to 10% deficit, which is still pretty horrific. Even with that 2021, the deficit, despite a lot of money coming in from the commodities boom, is still going to be the second highest on record of 7.8%. If you were to take out the rebasing of the economy, in other words, work on the same numbers that had been based in the past, then the figure would have been 9%. So we are in a pretty tough state. Those most recent numbers there that you see, the rebound, it is from, well, from a pretty horrific base of minus 10% last year. And as you can see, the improvement is what is projected for 23, 24, and 25. And we'll talk about that story in just a little while. The commodity prices made a big impact. In February, there was a projection for South Africa. The revenue was at 1.5 trillion and the spending of just over 2 trillion. That was where things were based. Now in November, you can see that the revenue was up 128 billion rand. So a big windfall coming from commodity prices, the mining sector helping South Africa a great deal, and they were affected by the commodity prices. This was information that was released today. However, when you have a look at the spending, it's now gone up 109 billion rands. So part of that was to help with COVID, some COVID relief. There was about 40 billion rand there. And then the big part of it was 20 billion rand more was spent on the public sector wages than had been budgeted for. And you might recall that we had a great skepticism when Tito in February said that over the next 3 years, they'd be cutting 265 billion rands off the public sector wage bill. And my suggestion was, well, if you get that right, then you're doing a Maggie Thatcher, which is not really the ANC's style. And you can see already, just 6 months later, they're already 20 billion ahead of in spending because of the latest wage bill negotiations. And remember, these are public sector workers, haven't really been working much in the last 18 months, most of them sitting at home. And if you are, for instance, issuing licenses in the licensing department, well, there's not a heck of a lot you can do if you're sitting at home. And many of these public servants don't even have connectivity, or certainly sufficient connectivity to enable them to continue to work. And yet, even with those circumstances, the unions are strong enough to give them an increase. So we are, well, we up a creek without a paddle. And you can see there that the budget balance, despite that juicy 128 billion that came in that was unexpected from the commodity boom, still hasn't made much of an impact. And the GDP, percentage of GDP, when 3% has been the norm in South Africa, 3.5 to 4 is kind of about as far as you want to push it. is still going to be looking at 9% this year. So not such good news on that front. I just included that graph to show you how interest payments have continued to rocket and are projected to continue to rocket. And that's a problem with these kind of situations, is when your debt goes up by so much. As you can see, 2007, 2008, it was really, it's sitting at like 50 billion rands a year. And we're going to be getting close to 350 billion rands, 7 times as much by 2024 on the current projections. And those projections are, they can always be changed positively, but South Africa's record is that they actually get changed the other way, negatively. Here's the dirty picture that I always put up on these presentations. It is South Africa's debt as a percentage of GDP. It's the number that we need to always look at, because when you just take the debt as a total figure and you show that against the total figure of another country's debt, of course, say take us to Namibia or Zimbabwe, South Africa would look pretty small. But when you do it as a percentage of the size of the economy, that's when you can start comparing countries against each other. And there we were in 2009 when Jacob Zuma came to office, sitting at a debt to GDP ratio of 26%, admired, one of the best in the world. And it had come down from 50%, which was post 1994, that many of the international community was saying, whoa, guys, you know, you really are getting too high at 50%. Well, they've rebased the economy, grown the economy overnight by nearly R500 billion, Stats SA. And as you can see, even with that, we're sitting at 65% projected debt to GDP, and we are projecting that to go to 77.8%, or the Treasury is projecting that to go to 78% in 2023. And it's not all Zuma's fault, although he put a heck of a lot of the problems in place. 35% of South Africa's spending now goes to public servant salaries. They're amongst the best paid in the world relative to the size of the economy, and they have been increasing their salaries by more than the inflation rate now, pretty much since every year since 2009. Growing by 8.8% total spending in South Africa in the last 13 years. And on the other hand, the revenue hasn't been growing by as much. And so you see what happens. If you spend more than you get in, there's only one way to address it, and that's debt. And there it is. There's our dirty picture. So what's next, Enoch? Well, what Enoch is telling us is those dotted lines, and you can look at those. He's saying, yes, we do have this the hippo jaws, and they've gone open, and the expenditure is the purple line, the maroon line, that's gone up, and then the revenues have gone down. But we will, as a country, says the finance minister, going to be reducing the spending, and we're going to be increasing revenue, so that come 2023, we'll get to, or 2025, we'll get to a primary. They love using this idea of a primary surplus. What they mean by that is if you take out the interest payments, then they're going to be a surplus in government. It's actually ridiculous, in my opinion, because you can't just wish away 21 cents in every rand that you're spending and saying, oh, that's interest. The interest is very much a part of the whole picture, of the whole pie. So, but at least I suppose you've got to start somewhere. And if you were to say, well, we'll get to 80%, we'll get to a point where revenue is 80% of our spending by 2025, doesn't sound quite as good as a primary surplus. It's another one of those South Africanisms, inventing a word like load shedding, which really means power blackouts, but load shedding sounds a heck of a lot better, doesn't it? He also points us to this. I must admit, Enoch Godongwana is certainly not one to try and fudge the truth. He and the team at the Treasury, they really do say it like it is. Hopefully, the people who need to listen, which is the other cabinet members, are doing so. He did mention that the various departments, despite this parlous situation that South Africa is in right now, still wanted an extra 200 billion in spending, or looking for another 200 billion in extra spending over and above the fact that we're already sitting at a budget deficit of 7.8% now with a bigger economy. The Treasury guys looked at that and then came back with a first counter offer, if you like, of well, okay, another 69 billion is worth considering of the 200. So they already managed to strip out 130 billion that the government departments wanted to spend in addition to this. But it really is a crazy situation. What this is talking about is that if your economy is growing less than what your interest rate is doing, in other words, if the rate of interest that you're paying on your debt is higher than what you're generating through economic growth, then you are going to have a situation where those hippo jaws just keep opening indefinitely. And he wanted to show this to us, and I think more likely to show it to his colleagues. This is something else. The dotted line shows the anticipated economic growth figure of 6.2% this year, which is just really a rebound from last year's contraction of 7%. But the next 3 years averaging 1.7% GDP growth. Now, when you are in a country that is got a population growth of 1.5%, that's just no way near good enough. And that's exactly what Gordon Dwana was telling us today and has been telling the nation through his speech. You cannot have a plan for an economy to grow at 1.7% when your population is growing at 1.6, because you're asking for big troubles. You can't keep paying money in social grants. The money doesn't exist. It needs to be borrowed, and the borrowing capacity is now gone. I wanted to put this in here. It came from the budget itself, from the main budget. It wasn't included in the mini budget today, but it gives you a good feeling for how government employees in South Africa are overpaid relative to those in other parts of the world. And you can see the share of GDP of our public servants is amongst the highest in the world, and yet you'd be hard pressed to say that the country is getting value for money from it. We're right up there with Denmark, Norway, Iceland, with the Scandinavian countries, and Sweden, and we're miles away from efficient economies like Korea, Ireland, Switzerland, Germany, Mexico. And the difficulty about all of this, of course, is the shrinking tax base. Every person who leaves the country, who emigrates, a skilled person who emigrates, is making a bigger dent in this. And you can see that. There's 7 million people now roughly who pay tax. And against that, the 18 million who get grants, well, because of the emergency grants, that's nearly 30 million people now who are on grants at the moment. It's, of course, unsustainable. And again, it's not new. This is something that the country's been told. It's just a problem that the politicians don't seem, or haven't seemed to this point, able to address it. And there's the social grants, the permanent social grants sitting at, going forward into the future, those are the next few years at more than 19 million people. So the headline that I put on the story was, why the hell should we believe you, Enoch? How are you going to do this? And he had to give us some kind of a insight, given especially that Tito Mboweni, as you can see, there he is, retired on his farm in Mkhubaskloof in the beautiful Mpumalanga province, where Tito has he's is cooking up a storm, but he always has been. Follow him on Twitter and you'll see what I mean. But he also is maybe going to be a significant cannabis producer into the future, all legally, of course. But there he is, looking happy, Tito, out on his farm. And he did leave, though, because, well, he said he was a reluctant appointee anyway. So what about Mr. Ngodwana? I'm going to start with, there really are 4 issues that he's focusing on. It's, on the one hand, he's got to get the restraint into government spending. And there is room for optimism there, because this is a guy with lots of political capital. I don't think we've had a finance minister with a similar political capital since Trevor Manuel. So let's just assume that he gets that right, that he becomes a finance minister who manages to get his colleagues to toe the line, the colleagues in cabinet, not overspend as they have been doing. Let's just assume that that's going to happen. He also has been saying in his speech, in his statements, and again in his speech today, and again what was in the Treasury documents, is that we can't talk about it anymore. We've really got to do this with the structural reforms, starting with Eskom. And I got quite a lot of hope from this, not because Eskom is any less hopeless. It really is in a dreadful state. In fact, Treasury is saying and warning us that the load shedding risk will only start reducing or lowering from around about the end of next year. That's quite sobering. How's that risk going to lower? Well, getting back to that initial quote that Enoch Godongwana made, which I've put at the beginning of this presentation, for 13 years, this government has been trying to fix the unfixable. It's been trying to repurpose an organization that is bloated with debt because of massive corruption and incompetence and inefficiencies. And we know that. We know about Medupi. We know about Kusile and the appalling state of affairs that has happened to the country as a result of that. Not only did we pay a heck of a lot more than we should have as taxpayers, but there's engineering faults which are being seen day to day. And on top of all of this, Godongwana reminded us that Eskom is going to be retiring a lot of its plant anyway, and it's not going to be building any new plant because it hasn't got money to go and build new plant. So we really are in a situation where at last the socialists and the central planners within the ANC are having to admit that that doesn't work. The Soviet Union didn't work, and this sure as heck doesn't work either. And so it's acceleration time now for bringing in the private sector. If that's the only thing that is being learned from the Eskom debacle, economic historians will look back in 100 years and say, well, it might have even been worth it. Because if you start unleashing the private sector in this area, in renewable energy and small power plants, you will find that the power far exceeds anything that we might have anticipated. Godongwana said the first step has been taken, and that was through the licensing, or rather the allowing of power plants to operate from up to 100 megawatts from the previous 1 megawatt. So that immediately will release quite a lot of power into the system. But he said that's only the first step. So we're looking forward to much more development on this side. And it'll be a little bit like when you have the dead hand of a monopoly being removed from a critical part. It's probably the most critical part of the economy. You don't have electricity, you don't have an economy, not a modern economy anyway. And that is a very big step for government, and one that they now have nailed their colors to the mast by saying the private sector has to make the running. The second thing is on Transnet. Government got a real wake-up call in these last 6 months with that 128 billion in unexpected revenue that came through, but it could have been so much higher. And Gordon Duano actually mentioned this. He said he doesn't know how the problems on the coal line is going to impact the country in the second half, or the public finances in the second half of the year. But the fact that this is being thought of now, that you can't just put your cadres into Transnet and expect that it's going to be okay, that everything will be fine, and okay, so you've got a few people who are in jobs that they shouldn't have, and what can that damage the economy? Well, it can damage the economy massively, because if those train lines are not running and those trains are not taking South Africa's minerals to the ports to be exported, then we miss out again on the commodity boom. And there is a boom at the moment, and one that could continue for a while, but it doesn't help you if you can't get your products to the ports to actually get exported. So that penny has very much dropped, and it is now part of the whole system to introduce the private sector aggressively. So using the rail network, using the railway lines that currently exist, and taking away the monopoly from Transnet and allowing the private sector to come in there. And there are plans to get this promulgated and up and running, third-party rail usage early next year. So just around the corner. These things do take time, and this is one that is now critical as far as government is concerned. The third big issue is broadband. Anyone who's in an industry like ours knows that the ability of widely dispersed and cheap broadband to kickstart the economy is just absolutely massive. This is Stella Ndabeni-Abrahams, who, when she was appointed as the Minister of Communications in 2018, and she's taken a lot of heat on the inability of the government to release the spectrum. But Gordon Duano says that there are two sides to the story, and a part of the story is the private sector. Every time the government is trying to release the spectrum, it's hit by a number of court cases, and she's had to go to court and go and fight there for the temporary spectrum, for instance. Also with the digital migration, there's lots of vested interests in this, but the confidence now in the ruling party is that they will be able to auction off the spectrum in March next year. 4.5 months to go. It'll be a welcome boost to public revenues, and it will also unleash a new driving force for the economy. So bring it all together, and sure, things are not rosy, not by a long stretch, but on the other hand, we do see a finance minister with a plan, and a plan that is not a gamble. Tito gambled in the last 2 years. The one you might recall was where he packaged, he felt he could cut public sector wage bill by enticing these guys, or a lot of them, to go on early retirement. They just refused. Nobody took up the package. It was an attractive package that was offered, but there was no interest. And if you consider what's happened in the last 18 months with COVID, where you could literally stay at home and draw a salary check and maybe play in the garden all day, you can see why these public servants didn't rush for the exit. And the second thing that Mboweni did try was in this year, in February this year, to cut 265 billion off the public sector wage bill in the next 3 years. That's what he wrote into his budget numbers. That's what he wrote into the figures. And as we know, that didn't work either, because the public sector unions seem to be a heck of a lot better negotiators, or maybe just more muscle than those on the other side that they are negotiating with. I'll just leave you this presentation with a final comment. I got the chance to ask the new finance minister a couple of questions, and one of them was to say, there is so little credibility now for you guys, because every year you come and give us a budget and you promise this and you promise that, and you say that you'll, like the last one, cut 265 billion off the public sector wage bill, And for an instant, we believe you. But when you don't fulfill your promises year after year after year, we stop believing you. And that's just us as journalists, international investors, or people who put in cold hard cash. They certainly don't believe you. How are you going to change that? And his point to that was, he didn't say, and I like this, he didn't say, I'm going to be different and I'm going to be right and I'll get it right. He said, I think you just got to watch our developments, and we should have something coming out before the State of the Nation, which is traditionally in the new year. So that also gives me, just the way he handled the question, just the way he responded, gave me some hope that this is not a guy who's telling you what you want to hear. It's a finance minister who's fully au fait with what is going on, what is really going on in the country, and the challenges that exist, and they're going to take a while to be addressed, but at least the process has begun. Stu, that's my presentation. I know I went on for a bit, but I hope that there's some questions that, or if there are questions, I will certainly happily answer.
Thanks. I got a comment from Zippo. He says, I'm in the mining industry, and I feel like the minister should have said that revenue from mining could have been a lot higher had Transnet and Eskom not messed things up. I think, as you mentioned earlier, as one of the economic impediments. That's just a comment from him.
Yeah, and what he's saying, what Zippo is saying, is something that is very, very well known. But it's just taken so damn long for Pretoria to listen to or to smell the coffee. The mining industry, I mean, how frustrated do you have to be where you are highly efficient, and we have an incredibly efficient mining sector. You mining this material, you've got lots of it, but you can't get it to the port because Transnet hasn't got, or the electricity, the electric trains have got no lines. They've been stolen, or their diesel trains just aren't working. It's quite sad, but at least in Transnet's defense, or in Ramaphosa's defense, he did appoint Popo Molefe as chairman a few years ago, and they have put a very competent woman in the guise of Portia Derby into the role as CEO, and they're completely mindful of this. And what Portia Derby and clearly the finance minister are doing is opening up to the private sector. So hopefully, Zippo, next year or the year thereafter, there will be competition between Transnet and the private sector to take the mining product to the ports, rather than at the moment it's kind of a take it or leave it.
I know Francois Nokia, we've chatted to him a few times. Like, he constantly sends pictures of problems on the Transnet lines because they're on that junction between Durban and Johannesburg. The Zippo had another that's at the Port of Gauteng. Zippo just mentioned, he says the social grant numbers is almost a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. And he also wonders how many of the 30 are actually legitimate claims for social grants themselves. But that's just another comment from Zippo.
It's an interesting point. Sorry, Stu, I need to answer that because there were quite a few questions, or I don't know, statements really, and just trying to get almost a bit of gotcha attempts with the minister by saying, well, how's the ANC going to now remove this emergency grant in March? Rather than saying, jeepers, we up a creek without a paddle, it was almost gleefully saying, well, people are starving and you've got to keep giving them grants. I wish people would listen to Gigi Alcock, for instance, and just go and have a look at what's really happening on the ground. And as Gigi often says, you just, teach a man to fish, don't give him fish all the time. So I'm with you, Zippo, on the grant story. I agree that there probably are a heck of a lot of people who are receiving grants who might actually be gainfully employed, or in this case of public servants, not really that gainfully employed, but employed nonetheless.
Thanks, Alec. As Zippo has a final comment, he says, we are coal choked, meaning they're stockpiling because they can't move product at any of the mines at Exxaro, Seriti, and Manar. He says not coal alone, it's iron ore and other commodities. It's just super frustrating. That's just from
It
Zico,
must
sorry.
be, yeah, super frustrating, but then think of the potential. Think of how we can turn this thing around. If we have a government which says, okay, private sector, let's embrace you.
Oratilia just asked if there was any mention of the investment conference, which has had to be moved to next year.
Yeah, that was my other question. I wanted to actually ask, what's happened to all these conferences and all the promises of investments? But that would have been a little trite and unfair. COVID happened to it, so I thought about it afterwards and thought, nah, you can't really. Let's see next year when things have calmed down from COVID and people can come back to the country again. But I am seeing little glimmers of hope. It's a little early to start making much of it.
Alec, is Enoch not more in line with Cyril? I mean, I know Tito was good, but he was almost like a stopgap and not really controllable in a sense. Is Enoch more on that same path as Cyril?
Definitely. You saw this coming through very strongly where there were questions. Remember, he is, as he kept, as he did tell us, he was only in the job for 106 days. But where there were questions about technical issues or more broader policy issues, he said, I know the ANC policy, but I'm not fully au fait with Treasury's policy yet. So would you, Dr. So-and-so, answer that question? Or would you, Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago, answer that one? So he was quite happy. He looks like a good manager to actually allocate. But the way you could look at it was that it was almost like you had Cyril in the room, and Cyril was answering the questions through Enoch Godongwana. They're very closely aligned. He has a lot of political capital in the party through his other positions, but also he's very close to the president. And you need that from your finance minister. Your finance minister, if you could have a finance minister who is almost like a cardboard cutout of your president, then you know, and Mbeki and Manuel were like this, then you know that they're talking, that the whole of cabinet is talking with one voice. Tito is a maverick. He has his own ideas. He has his own suggestions. He'll try things. He's innovative. He's a phenomenal human being, and he was a very good finance minister. But as you say, he was a bit of a stopgap. Cyril had to get rid of Gigaba. The country had to get rid of Gigaba, and Tito was the one person who could have come in and turned perceptions around quickly, and he did.
Thanks, Alec. John just says, why does no one not talk about the dreadful job Gwede Mantashe has done and not moving forward with renewables a few years ago?
Yeah, it's a big question, John. Gwede Mantashe again, he's a trade unionist. He's got a big constituency. He's a NUMGA, National Union of Mine Workers. They don't really want to see the mines, coal at least, being phased out too quickly. He's a big protagonist for coal. He's an interesting guy, and I think there are many who feel he's the worst member of the cabinet. But he's close to Ramaphosa, and he's also survived scandals. One right now at the moment, actually, that's going through, which we'll see if he survives that one too. But it's a very good question, and one that probably will be have mines applied to in time ahead.
I see he's also recently put his heart on the sleeve, Alec, by fighting the sort of reduction in coal use with the global deal that was signed.
Yeah, you got to also remember that there's a heck of a lot of hype that's brought in with these transactions and these deals, and then the media does get ahead of itself, and people get worked up and start exaggerating, and perhaps the yes but person in the room is not to be dismissed out of hand, and he's very much a yes but or giving the yes but suggestions.
Thanks, Alec. Ray just wants to ask, how credible are the plans to increase infrastructure investment and leverage the private sector participation and contribution to future infrastructure spend?
They're very credible. You know, I do know that often perhaps because of what Zuma did and Zuma's big talk and no action, we often question government. But Godongwana explains that there's 100 billion a year that's being spent on infrastructure over the next few years. It's in the budgets. It's been planned. And when we look at the financial results of construction companies, we're seeing it coming through. It certainly was in the Robex results recently. We also see the Wilson Bailey and Avenge teams, sorry, not Avenge, Wilson Bailey and it'll come to me in a moment, but yeah, PPC as well. We see the growth in the order books there. You know, there's just so few construction companies. I mean, Avenge have got a mining construction company in South Africa, but that's it. That's all that's left. But anyway, it's the look at the results in the construction sector. Look at it. Look with your eyes. When you travel around, there's a heck of a lot of work being done on roads as well. And that's government's remit, government spending that money. So it's coming through. It's got credibility.
Alec, I know you wrote earlier on the 4 economic impediments. You mentioned the 3, but you didn't touch on red tape. I'm not sure if you want to expand on that.
Yes, that was the 4th of the impediments, or the 4 economic impediment horses of the apocalypse, horsemen of the apocalypse. The 4th one, well, just to recap: Eskom, Transnet, broadband, and the 4th one is bureaucracy. And there were a few specific items there which will hearten us. Under Gigaba / Zuma, there was very little attention paid to tourism. And if you recall, that was the time that they introduced this wacky idea that you had to have unabridged birth certificates. Now, overlay on that the fact that in many countries in the world, you have to go to the South African consul to get a visa to come to South Africa. And you really are up against it if you're trying to attract tourists to this country. In early next year, the e-visas will be available for people traveling to South Africa for the first time. This unabridged birth certificate story has been long forgotten and has been changed. But to make it possible, say, for someone in China to visit this country without having to go to the South African consul or embassy in Beijing, which might be thousands of kilometers away, suddenly opens up a whole new vista of opportunity. So e-visas for a long-haul destination like South Africa that is competing with many others around the world is a massive breakthrough, and it's something that we'll be seeing coming through early next year. The other specific that was mentioned is the visas for skilled workers. Again, in the Zuma era, they didn't want skilled people from overseas. The idea was that, well, anyone can do the job. And I have that from, well, let me share a story with you. There was a meeting while business and government and the Zuma administration were actually talking to each other. There was a meeting at Gallagher Estate, the big conference center in Johannesburg, or near Johannesburg in Midrand. And Zuma had on his side of the table his cabinet ministers, most of them lackeys plucked out of nowhere, but their loyalty was not in question, and loyalty to him not in question. And on the other side of the table, you had business executives. And one of the executives said to him, Mr. Zuma, the problem we've got is, where's the leadership? And he said, look around you. These are the leaders. And that was exactly the point. For Zuma, if he got a guy from a low-ranking individual in the Free State who the Guptas told him to appoint as Minister of Mines, well, Mr. Zwane got appointed Minister of Mines, even though A, he knew nothing about mining, and B, he should have had about 25 people within the party who were ahead of him on the pecking order. But of course, not all of those would have had undying loyalty to the big boss. And that has translated also into this philosophy, well, anyone can do the job. Even Dudu Mayeni could run an airline. And as a consequence, why do you need skilled people from other parts of the world in your economy when you've got lots of people here unemployed who can do the job? That philosophy, that stupid philosophy, has been completely overturned. And now the government is looking at ways of making it easier to get skilled people to actually come here, on the understanding that if you have these bottlenecks in the economy because you aren't producing the skills in South Africa, which we can't do for everything, then bring them in, bring people in, and they will help economic growth generally.
Thanks, Alec. I think we've almost come to the end. I've got a question. I see the rand did strengthen a little bit. I know we can't read too much into that. Was usually a good sign outside looking in for these sorts of days.
It's always a good sign. The most you could have hoped for was a stable rand. This is an unknown entity in the new finance minister. When you are talking with your wallet, when it's cold hard cash and you're looking into a country from outside, you want to be enthused, but on the other hand, more than that, you don't want to lose your money. You don't want to get a person in that job who is going to disappoint you and who's going to take the country in the wrong direction. It often happens that with analysts, they take a while to reflect, they take a while to kind of absorb, and then they make their recommendations to the investment committee. In this case, what we saw today from the new finance minister was heartening. And when you've reflected on it as an investment analyst, you might well come to the conclusion that it could work this time. You're going to still be skeptical because you've had many, many promises, and those promises have always been unfulfilled. But there are points in his speech today. There's points in the presentation. There's an understanding, an appreciation for where South Africa is that I haven't seen before. It was almost like in the past, even with Tito, he was trying to work against the system because the system would have rejected the rationality that he was trying to bring in. So he would look at doing things like balance the books by, we're going to write off 265 billion from the public sector wage bill in the next 3 years. With hindsight, and at the time we said it sounded ridiculous, but he must have known something to say that. This time round, you almost get the feeling, not you get the feeling, you get the insight and the understanding that the system is changing, that the finance ministry, that the treasury, which has always been this pocket of excellence in South Africa, well, always in the new South Africa, in democracy, that the treasury is actually getting its message heard. It's not out there as a polecat for the rest of government, as it was in the Zuma era. It is actually integral to government and understood. The numbers are understood. It's like if you like, it's like in a company having an accountant who keeps telling you that, guys, we can't keep spending like this. We're going bankrupt. We've got to do things differently. And it continues to give you that message. But everybody around the table is so drunk that they're not listening to the accountant. They're just laughing at the accountant. They shut up, man, go next door. And now that accountant, people have stopped drinking. They've sobered up really, really significantly. They might have a little bit of a sore head from a bit of a babalas, but they are listening to the accountant and they're saying, okay, we don't want to get into the situation that you've described for us. What do we do about it? We know that the private sector always was the enemy, but we got to make friends with them. Let's bring them in. We know that the other political parties were the arch enemy, but now they must help us to fix another ticking time bomb, which is the municipalities. So when you look at it in that context, at least there are signs that we won't continue to slide.
Excellent. Thanks as always, Alec. I know it's a long day, budget day, but the insight's invaluable. So thanks for your time.
It's my pleasure. And I really got to thank the guys at Treasury. They put on a great show there. They really look after us with all the information we need. And the openness of the finance minister today in the press conference, which went on for an hour and a bit, it's so good being there, having the privilege of being able to sit there and listen and ask the questions, any questions you want to. and just seeing the body language, it's the unsaid stuff that often makes a big difference. And yeah, I'm a South African. I love my country, and I'm maybe going to sleep just a little bit easier tonight than I did last night after what I saw today.
Especially with that view to wake up to, Alec, I'm sure.
Indeed.
Yes.
Good stuff, Stu. Good talking with
Yes,
you, and thanks to the community members who are here tonight, and obviously everyone is still going to watch the recording.